it's starting to take over. Abraham was a great man of faith, but he was showing his human side here. And how many people today, when a true crisis hits, instead of praying to God, they lose their faith. They don't pray to God. They start looking for another way out. And this is what Abraham was doing. He was looking for another way out. He said in verse 18, he said, why not let Ishmael live before thee? In other words, he wasn't taking God at his word. He was looking for another way out. And he says, why not let Ishmael live before thee? And Abraham, of course, he'd been raising Ishmael now. Ishmael at this particular time was 13 years old, and he was the son by Sarah's maid Hagar. And but this was just not God's plan. This was not God's plan. Sarah and Hagar had planned this, and Abraham had went along with it. Abraham and Sarah had tried to, on their own logic, tried to do this. But God has His own plan. God was different. Sarah's son would be the heir to the covenant, and this is the way it was going to be. God's plan always is going to come to pass, and He's going to come to pass this time. And in verse 19, and God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son, indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And so God is not bound by human logic. God immediately rejected Abraham's plan, and when God speaks, the impossible becomes possible when God speaks. And God's plan would require faith, and that's really what that's what God wanted from Abraham and Sarah in the first place, was faith. Their job was to have faith. God would take care of all the rest. But God has given them, He could have given them a son earlier. But He's waiting for their faith. He's waiting for them to mature and have that faith. But God's covenant was that He wanted to display His characteristics to the rest of the world. And His characteristics are based on faith. And so Abraham and Sarah, He wanted them to have a legitimate son that He could base His covenant on. And the name Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. And the disbelieving laughter of Abraham and Sarah here soon turns to the laughter of joy. And in verse 20, God's selection of Isaac as his heir, it didn't really mean that God didn't care about Ishmael. No, God still loved Ishmael, and God was going to make many nations out of Ishmael. But this was just not God's plan. But Ishmael would go on to be father of the Arab people, which the verse mentions 12 princes would come from him, but actually this blossomed out into 22 different nations today. There's 22 different Arab nations today, and they're all can trace it back to Ishmael. But there's resentment today between the Arab nations and Israel, and part of that resentment is because of what we're just talking about in today's lesson, because of the birthright of Isaac. In verses 21 and 22, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. And he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. And so God concluded His appearance to Abraham by saying in approximately 1 year, Sarah was going to give birth to a son of her own. God, of course, is omnipresent. He's omnipowerful. He is active in working out the affairs of humankind. A lot of people think that God just created this thing and He just went back and He's just sitting back up there. But that's not true. He is active in human affairs today. And God's plans and His will are going to be carried out down to the very last letter and I dotted and T crossed. Now, all this was done in accordance with God's grace. Abraham and Sarah had really done nothing to deserve it. As a matter of fact, they proved to be hard cases and even laughed at the prospect of God's plan. But God's grace and His was going to be carried out. And of course, Abraham became father of the Israelites, Sarah became mother of the Israelites, and then they revealed God's characteristics. And then, of course, at the time that was appointed, God brought forth his son Jesus into the world to reveal himself perfectly. But back to Abraham. Abraham, he was a man of faith, but he was not really a sinless man. Twice he tried to pass off Sarah as his sister. When Abraham first got to the land of Canaan, there was a famine, and so after a brief stay, he went into Egypt. Sarah was 70 at the time, and the Bible lets us know that Sarah was still a beautiful woman, even at 70. And Abraham was fearing that the Pharaoh might take Sarah into his harem, and so he tried to pass off Sarah as his sister. And then, of course, the Pharaoh did find out about it, and so God had to intervene and by plagues, and the Pharaoh then had to pay him to leave. And then, of course, in chapter 17 and 18, God appeared to Abraham with the news of the promised heir once again. In chapter 19, that was our chapter last week where we discussed Sodom and Gomorrah and the evil and their sinful behavior. Next, Abraham, after Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham moved southwest and got into trouble once again. As I said in the previous lesson, he was a great man of faith, but he was not he was also a sinful man. But when he moved southwest, he once again tried to pass off Sarah as his sister to the king of Gerar. And he tried to pass off that the same way he did before. But the king of Gerar did take Sarah into his harem. But I'm mentioning this because this was only 3 months after God promised Abraham and Sarah that they were going to give birth to an heir. In other words, only 3 months had passed since chapter 17 when he told them that this time next year you're going to have a child. Only 3 months had passed, and during this 3 months he's trying to pass Sarah off as his sister once again. And the problem with this is if she did get taken into the harem, then how would they know that it was Abraham's child? And so God once again had to intervene on behalf to make this thing come out right. He had to intervene once again to the king of Gerar, whose name was Abimelech. And he told Abimelech, rather than punish Abimelech, he told him exactly what the situation was. But he did say that, if you don't let her go, he would die. So in other words, what he did is he made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And so Abimelech, the king, once again, paid Abraham to leave. And so the point is that God's grace and his mercy is going to happen. And God was having to work around a lot of Abraham's faults. But humankind and mankind can depend on God, and what God says will come to happen, will come to happen. And God can even take poor decisions of mankind and still make some goodness come out of it, and that's what was happening here. And then so very shortly after this episode, Sarah did become pregnant, and that's where we pick up in chapter 21, with finally get into 21 with the birth of Isaac. In chapter 21, verses 1 and 2, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And so in verses 1, God intervened in Sarah's life. The conception of Isaac was foretold by God many times. And God had told both Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child even in their old age. And now Sarah... we have to understand that she lived in a male-dominated world. In this particular time, females really had no rights. But what this is showing us is it's showing this that every person, every human being is valuable to God. And God loves males, he loves females. Everybody's important to God, and he takes care of both males and females. And everything's going to work out to God's plan. And in chapter 18, the Lord in verses 10 through 14 repeated his promise of an heir to Abraham and Sarah. And in verse 2 tells us that Sarah conceived when she was 89 years old, and Abraham was 99 years old. And when the male child was born, Sarah was 90 years old, and Abraham was 100 years old. What this is telling us is just what a miracle from God, this birth came about just like God said it would happen. This also validated God's other promises to Abraham, and Abraham's descendants would become as numerous as the stars, as we found in Genesis chapter 15, and also Genesis chapter 12 tells us that Abraham would father a great nation, and 12:3 tells us that all the families of the earth would be blessed from this, not just the Jewish people, but all families would be blessed. And then it goes into detail in verse 3. Verse 3 tells us that God had a plan, and that plan would come about at an appointed time. And out of Abraham's descendants would come the nation of Israel, and out of the descendants of Israel would come the Messiah, as we see in Galatians chapter 4. And also in Acts 1:7 tells us that at the appointed time, God's promises were realized in Jesus, his son. Now, at the time of Abraham, the mother usually named the child, but here in verse 3, it tells us that Abraham took the lead because God had really specified the boy's name in chapter 17, verse 19. The name at that time in history, it was to express the character of a person and the essence of a person. And so, an example would be that God instructed Joseph to name Mary's baby Jesus, which means Yahweh is salvation, because Jesus would save people from their sins. And so here Abraham names his son Isaac, which means laughter. And that's because Abraham and Sarah both laughed at the prospect of having a child in their advanced age. And God, of course, nothing is impossible with God. Amen. And then in verse 4 and 5, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. And so Abraham's covenant relationship with God was based on faith. And faith leads to obedience, and that's what really God wanted from Abraham to begin with, was obedience. And Abraham was not a sinless man, but he was a faithful man. And we can see that because he departed a comfortable lifestyle. He lived the first 75 years of his life in the land of Haran in Ur. And it was very comfortable. He knew where all of the good grazing land was. He had plenty of animals. He was very comfortable in his lifestyle. But God made a call on him, and he answered the call. A lot of times we get, life gets kind of boring sometimes. I mean, sometimes we go years without really making a life-changing experience or a life-changing decision. And then all of a sudden something happens and forces us to make a decision that's going to affect us the rest of our life. And it's the same thing with Abraham here. He lived the first 75 years of his life with a comfortable lifestyle, with the people he knew, and then God made a call on him. And he had a very difficult decision to make, but he made that decision on faith. And here we can see the results of that. And then also we're told in this verse that the covenant was made, and the sign of that covenant would be a circumcision. God commanded the procedure to be done on the 8th day after birth. He did that in chapter 17, verse 12. And then verse 5 here highlights this great miracle. Sarah was a barren woman for 89 years, and logic would tell you that it's biologically impossible, to conceive at that age. But with God, all things are possible, and God fulfilled his promises to Abraham, and he also fulfilled his promises to Sarah. And this also shows us that every word in the Bible is going to come to pass, regardless of how illogical it seems. With God, God can take the illogical and make it logical. And that's what we have here. God's not bound by any human logic. God is God, and he always will be God. In verses 6 and 7, and Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah would have given children suck, for I have borne him a son in his old age. And so verses 6 and 7 here begins to give Sarah's perspective of what had just happened. And first of all, she was overjoyed. She was overjoyed with laughter. And in that day and time, women that could not bear children, there was this kind of a lifelong stigma that followed them around. People would think you must have done something to deserve to be childless. And she had had to fight that her entire life. In John 9:2, the disciples asked Jesus, they said, and his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. And so here we can see why Sarah was unable to bear a child for 89 years so that the works of God could be made manifest in her. And so this was, and so Sarah was just overjoyed. And, Sarah herself, you have to put yourself in kind of her shoes. You know, when somebody is born with a problem, they don't just have that problem for a day. They don't have that problem for an hour or for a minute. They have that problem for the rest of their life. Sometimes people don't understand, but, you know, if a child has a special ed need, whatever, and I taught a lot of kids, and it just dawned on me that, you know, they don't have that need for one day or for 1 hour in your classroom or whatever. They got to live with that problem their whole life. Right. Their whole life. And Sarah here had lived in personal, she had lived the first 89 years of her life. She felt inside of her, because of all of the stuff coming to her, that she was a personal failure. But she was not a personal failure, and now we get to see that she is overjoyed, for she said in that verse, For I have borne him a son in his old age. And she was just overjoyed. Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah now was 90. And that all sets up into next week's lesson. Abraham had wanted this child forever. And next week, he's going to have to give all of that up to make Isaac a sacrifice. And so next week we will get into that seemingly impossible situation where he has wanted this for 100 years, and now he has to make a decision on faith. And that's what God wanted from the very beginning with taking Abraham back in the land of Ur. He really wanted faith on Abraham's part, and he's going to put him to the ultimate test in next week's lesson. Amen. Got any comments or questions on today's lesson? It's good to see everybody out there. It's good to see a real pretty day today after all of the threats we've had the previous 2 Sundays and that kind of stuff.